Chapter 10, in which Cimorene and Alanora conduct some tests and disturb a wizard. Back in the kitchen, Cimorene and Alanora quickly determined that the fireproofing spell had indeed worked. First Cimorene, then Alanora tossed a pinch of feverfew into the air and recited the spell verse, then put a hand into a candle flame and held it there. Neither was burned at all, though Alanora claimed that the candle tickled almost as much as the eagle feather had done. "How long does the spell last?" Alanora asked. "I'm not sure exactly," Cimorene said. "At least an hour, but I'll have to do some tests to pin it down beyond that. I hope Kazil gets back in time. I want to see if it works with dragonfire." "You're going to have Kazil breathe fire at you just to see if the spell works?" she asked, horrified. "What if it doesn't?" "Then I'll talk to Kazul and we'll go see Morwen, and the three of us will try to figure out what to change to make the spell work for dragonfire too." "Don't look at me like that. I'm not going to stand in front of her and have her breathe fire at me. I'll just stick out a finger the way we did with the candle." That was not enough to convince her, but Cimorene was determined. The whole point of trying the spell was to make ourselves immune to dragonfire, she said. "If it doesn't work, I don't want to find out for the first time when one of Kazul's guests gets mad and breathes fire at me because he doesn't like the way I cooked his cherries jubilee." Alanora had to admit that was a good point, but she was still disposed to argue. The discussion was cut short by Kazul's return. At first, the dragon was more inclined to agree with Alanora than with Cimorene, but after Cimorene proved her invulnerability to candle flame, lighted torches, and the fire she built in the kitchen stove, the dragon agreed to the trial. She insisted, however, on working up to full firepower in gradual stages, and the princess was forced to agree. Before they began, the princess threw another pinch of feverfew into the air and recited the couplet again, just to be sure the spell wouldn't wear off in the middle of the test. Then the dragon lowered her head nearly to the ground, and Alanora watched nervously as Cimorene lowered her hands slowly into various intensities of dragon flame. Finally, the princess stood right in front of the dragon while the dragon breathed her hottest. The spell worked perfectly every time. "There!" the princess said when Kazil stopped at last. "Now we know it works. Aren't you glad?" "I'm glad," Eleanor said, "and I hope I never have to watch anything like that again as long as I live. I didn't dare blink for fear you'd go up in smoke while my eyes were closed." "Why don't you try it yourself?" Cimorene asked mischievously. No, said Eleanor and Kazul together. "Watching you was bad enough," Eleanor went on with a shudder. "I believe it works. I don't see any reason for me to test it. Besides, I've done more than enough fire breathing for one day," the dragon said. "I'm starting to get overheated." "All right, if you don't want to, you don't have to," Cimorene said. "If we're all done, I better go tidy up." Eleanor stayed to help Cimorene finish cleaning up the traces of the spell, by which time she had calmed down considerably and was nearly her usual self again. Cimorene gave her a pouchful of dried feverfew before she left, and made her recite the words that activated the spell several times to make sure she had memorized them correctly. "Remember, you only have to repeat the first half of the verse to get the spell going, now that it's been set up. Can you do it?" "It's only 2 lines and they rhyme," she said, laughing. "How could I forget that? My memory isn't that bad." "Maybe not, but say it anyway," Cimorene asked her. Eleanor laughed again and did so. At last she set off into the tunnels, and Cimorene went back to the main cave to see what Kazul and Roxham had found out about the caves of fire and night. Kazul was somewhat out of temper, and Cimorene thought privately that she'd been telling the truth about getting overheated. Rather than annoy the dragon further, Cimorene asked if she could read the book Kazul had borrowed from Morwen. "It's in the treasure room. Read it there, and I hope you see something in it that we didn't." The princess nodded, picked up her lamp, and hurried off before the dragon could change her mind. The book was lying near a pile of sapphires next to an ornate gold crown. She picked it up, went over to the table, which was large and very sturdy because it was intended for counting piles of gold and silver coins, and sat down to read. It was even drier and duller than the dragon had said. There were a great many mayhaps and perchances and wherefores strung together in long, involved sentences that compared the strange and wonderful things in the caves to obscure philosophical ideas and odd customs from places Cimorene had never heard of. After a few pages, Cimorene put the book down and went and got a quill pen, an inkpot, and some paper so that she could write down the things she thought were important. She didn't want to have to read A Journey Through the Caves of Fire and Night more than once. For the next 3 days, the princess spent bits of her spare time in the treasure room, taking notes on the book, It took her that long because she could never manage to read for more than a little while without getting so bored that she nearly fell asleep. Her persistence gained her several pages of notes about the caves, but nothing that seemed as if it might be particular interest to wizards. Eleanor came to see her a few days later, looking very cheerful. "It worked," she announced as she came into the library, where Cimorene was going over her notes. "Cardwell is gone. Therendale rescued her just the way you said he would." "Oh, good," Cimorene said. "I'm glad something is going right." "Well, what's the problem?" Eleanor asked, seating herself on the other side of the table from Cimorene. "This," Cimorene said, waving at the paper-covered table. "Kazul is sure that the key to what the wizards are after is somewhere in that dratted book she borrowed from Morwen. I copied out everything that looked interesting, but none of it seems like anything a wizard would care about." "How do you know that?" Eleanor asked curiously. "I don't. I'm just guessing. That's the problem." "Oh." She picked up a sheet of paper nearest her and frowned at it. "What on earth does this mean?" Cimorene looked at the page she was holding. "Thus these caves of fire and night are, in some sense, indivisible, where the caves of chance are, by contrast, individual, though it is preposterous to claim that these descriptions are true of either group of caves in their entirety." That's one of the bits I copied word for word, and the whole book is like that. I think it means that if you have a piece of something magical from the caves of fire and night, you can use it in a spell as if it were the whole thing. I can see why you wouldn't be sure. Do you think it would help you figure things out if you stopped for a while? "I have stopped," she pointed out. "Or did you have something more specific in mind?" "I'm almost out of feverfew," she said, looking down at the table. "I was hoping you'd come with me to pick some more." "You're almost out?" Cimorene said in surprise. "How did that happen?" Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. "I've been working that fireproofing spell every hour or so for the past 2 days," she admitted. "Warrock has been getting more and more unpredictable, and I don't feel comfortable otherwise. Hollyana was visiting yesterday when he came in the middle of the afternoon, and he was roaring and dripping little bits of flame when he breathed. She was terrified, and I don't blame her. If it weren't for the spell, I'd be scared to death." "What's the matter with him?" "I don't know. He doesn't tell me anything about dragon politics or wizards or what he's been getting so worked up about. He's not like Kazul." Cimorene frowned, considering. Maybe Kazul will have some idea what's bothering him. I'll ask her this evening. In the meantime, let's go get that feverfew. You're right to say that I could use a break." "Oh, good," she said in tones of considerable relief. "I've never picked herbs before, and I'm not sure what feverfew looks like. I don't know what I've done if you had said you wouldn't come." Cimorene put her notes away and got 2 wicker baskets and a small knife from one of the storage rooms. "Up or down?" Eleanor asked as they left the cave. "Up," Cimorene said. "The other way is the ledge I told you about, and I wouldn't be surprised if bits of it are still invisible." The path through the pass of silver ice twisted and turned past the openings of other dragons' caves. Most of the rocks around the cave had scorch marks, and Cimorene and Eleanor didn't see much growing among them. "At this rate, we'll have to go nearly all the way to the enchanted forest to find any grass, much less herbs," she complained. "Oh, wait a minute," Cimorene said. "Look over there through that crack in the rocks. Doesn't that look like something green?" Eleanor's eyes followed Cimorene's pointing finger. "Ooh. Yes," she said without enthusiasm. "It looks green." The rock Cimorene had indicated was a large boulder at the bottom of a steep slope. The slope was covered with gravel and looked as if it would be impossible to climb down without skinning a knee or an elbow at the very least. The boulder itself was in 2 pieces, with just enough space between them for someone to squeeze through, provided that someone was not very large. "Come on, let's get a better look," said Cimorene. She walked to the edge of the slope and wrapped her skirts tightly around her legs. Then she sat down with her basket in her lap and slid down the slope, raising an enormous cloud of dust and sounding like an avalanche in the process. She reached the bottom in safety and stood up, brushing at her skirt. The dust was so thick she could hardly see, and when she tried to call to Eleanor, she coughed so hard that she could barely speak. "Cimorene, are you all right?" "It's just the dust," she said in a muffled voice. She had taken out her handkerchief and put it over her mouth and nose to keep the dust out. It wasn't perfect, but it helped a great deal. "Come on, it's your turn." "Are you sure we shouldn't just go around?" "Stop stalling. It's not that bad." "That's what you say," Eleanor muttered, but she wrapped her skirts around her, clutched her basket, and slid down the slope. She made even more noise than Cimorene had. When she got to the bottom, she was coughing and choking. Cimorene handed her the handkerchief, and they waited for a moment while the dust settled. Crawling through the split boulder was easier than expected. The crevice was wider than it had looked from the path, and the bottom of the crack was so full of dust and gravel and dead leaves that it was almost flat. Cimorene and Eleonora had to walk single file, and there was 1 or 2 spots where they had to turn sideways in order to get through, but it was not really difficult. On the other side of the boulder, the 2 girls found a lush green valley. It was bowl-shaped and not very large, but flowers and grasses stood waist-high between the random clumps of bushes that dotted the valley floor. A squirrel, which had been sunning itself on a ledge near the entrance, leaped for a small tree as the princesses appeared. "Ooh, my goodness," Eleanor said, looking around with wide eyes. "This place looks as if no one but us has ever been here before. There aren't even any scorch marks on the rocks." "My goodness," Eleonora said, looking around with wide eyes. "This place looks as if no one but us has ever been here before. There aren't even any scorch marks on the rocks." Cimorene blinked. Eleonora was right. Lichens covered the weathered gray rocks that rose above the valley, and small plants grew in cracks and crevices that showed no sign of the touch of dragon fire. "That's odd," Cimorene commented. "Why?" Eleonora asked. "These mountains aren't tall enough to keep dragons from flying over, and they're right in the middle of the dragon's territory. So why haven't the dragons been here? They usually keep a close eye on everything that belongs to them. Maybe they have been here but never found anything to breathe fire at?" "Well, I'm going to ask Kazul about it when I get back," Cimorene said as she waded into the grass. "Why don't you take that side and I'll look over here? We'll cover more ground that way." "First, you better show me what I'm looking for," she said apologetically. "I'm afraid I couldn't tell feverfew from carrots if there was a dragon chasing me and my life depended on it." Cimorene nodded and they started off. They had not gone far when she saw a patch of the white button-shaped flowers that she was looking for. "Here," she said, pointing to them. "This is feverfew. The younger plants are the best, the ones that haven't blossomed yet." She studied the leaves and flowers with care. "I think I'll recognize it now." They cut some of the plants, leaving those that were blooming. "You find the next patch," she said as they started off again. "Let's try over there," Eleanor said, pointing. They found several more patches of feverfew, and gradually their baskets began to fill. "I think this should be enough," Cimorene said at last. "Unless you think—" "Cimorene!" Eleanor hissed, clutching at Cimorene's arm. "There's someone behind that bush." Cimorene turned. A dark line snaked through the grass where something large had bent and broken the plants in passing. "You're right," she said and started forward. Eleanor hung back, still holding Cimorene's arm. "You're not going to go look, are you?" "How else are we going to find out who it is?" Cimorene asked reasonably. She shook off her hand, and quietly, she walked over to the clump of bushes and peered around it. Eleonora followed with evident reluctance. A man in blue and brown silk robes was crouched on the other side of the bush, with his back towards Cimorene. He was stuffing saw-edged purple leaves into a small linen bag the size of Cimorene's hand. His hair was brown, and on the ground beside him lay a long, polished staff. "Antoro?" Cimorene said in surprise. The man snatched up his staff and straightened as if a bee had just stung him. It was indeed Antoro, and he did not look at all pleased to see her. He stuffed the linen bag quickly into his sleeve and said, "Princess Cimorene, what brings you here?" "I was about to ask you the same thing." "Wizards go where they wish, answering to no one," he said, waving his free hand in a lofty manner. "Maybe outside the mountains of morning they do, but around here they have to check with the dragons first." "You know nothing of the matter," Antorin said, looking very put out. "Cimorene?" Eleanor's tone was doubtful. "You know this person?" "I'm sorry, I should have introduced you. This is Antoro, one of the wizards I was telling you about. Antoro, this is Princess Eleonora of the Duchy of Tora-on-Marsh. At the moment, she is the Princess of Dragon Warog." Eleanor curtsied, murmuring something polite and inaudible. Antoro, who had stiffened at surprise when he realized that Cimorene was not alone, relaxed visibly. "Warog's princess? That's all right then, though I really shouldn't have sent you." "But Warog didn't— Ow!" said Eleanor. The ow was because Cimorene had hastily kicked her ankle to keep her from telling Antoro too much. "Didn't what?" he asked, frowning suspiciously. "Didn't know you were going to be here," Cimorene said. Well, of course he didn't know, he said, looking annoyed. That's the whole point, after all. Cimorene would have very much liked to ask him what the point was, but she was afraid that it would make him suspicious again. I don't understand, she said instead, batting her eyes at him. Of course not, he said, replied in a condescending tone that made Cimorene's teeth hurt. But it doesn't matter. I'm not annoyed with you. I'm so glad, Cimorene murmured. He gave her an oily smile. In fact, there's no need for you to tell Warg that you met me here. I wouldn't dream of it, Cimorene said with perfect truth. Excellent. Then may I escort the two of you back to the path? Eleanor looked hopefully in Cimorene's direction. Oh, we can't leave yet, she said, opening her eyes very wide. We haven't picked any cornflowers or daisies. Beside her, she heard Eleanor making a smothered, choking noise, as if she was trying very hard not to laugh. Daisies, he said in a flat, incredulous tone. You want to stay and pick daisies. She nodded vigorously. And cornflowers and flax and all sorts of things, she said, waving her hand at the flowers blooming all around. They look so pretty in a bowl of water in the kitchen. I'm sure you're right, he said. He looked as if he would have liked to object, but couldn't think of anything to object to. Perhaps I could help you, he said reluctantly. Oh, we wouldn't dream of keeping you. Antoro was clearly reluctant to leave the two girls in the valley, but Cimorene did not give him much choice. After another minute or so of conversation, the wizard was forced to go. He did not use a vanishing spell, but trudged away on foot. She watched him until he was out of sight among the bushes, wondering whether he had special reason not to use spells in the valley, or whether he simply didn't know the right spells to make himself vanish. Oh, that's a relief, she said. Why did you insist on staying when it was obvious that he wanted us to leave? I was afraid he was going to turn us into toads or something. I wanted to see what he was up to. And I don't think Antoro is a very good wizard. He probably couldn't manage anything worse than a squirrel. Eleanor did not appear to find this very reassuring. Cimorene checked to make sure Antoro was out of sight, then went over to the place where he had been standing when she peered around the bush. At first she did not notice anything unusual. Then she saw the purplish plant oozing sap from the places where several of its spiky, saw-toothed leaves had been broken off. Look at this. Look at what? Eleanor asked. I don't know, she said absently. I saw a couple of other plants like this while we were picking feverfew, but I thought they were just weeds. Maybe it is a weed. A wizard wouldn't sneak into the dragon section of the mountains in the morning just to pick weeds. They don't even use herbs to cast spells. So what does Antoro want with this prickly-looking thing? Eleanor shrugged. Maybe he needs it for something he can't do with magic? I wonder what that would be. She reached out and carefully broke off a spray of leaves. She wrapped them in her handkerchief and put the packet in her pocket. Let's see if we can find out whether he picked anything else. He had left a dark trail of bent and broken plants to mark the way he had come, so his path was easy to follow. The princesses searched carefully along it for some way, looking for signs that the wizards had picked other herbs, and neither of them saw any. I don't think there was anything to find, she said, pushing her apricot-colored hair out of her face, and it's getting awfully warm. Have you noticed that there aren't any of those purplish plants along here? I bet that was all he wanted. Then let's leave before that wizard thinks to circle around and check on what we're doing, Eleanor urged. Cimorene doubted that Antoro would think of doing such a thing, but she nodded agreement, and the two girls left the valley. Eleanor was quiet and thoughtful for most of the walk back to Kazul's cave. Cimorene was grateful for her silence. She had a lot to think about herself. From what Antoro had said, it seemed likely that Warog was helping the wizards somehow, or at least that he had known what Antoro was looking for in the little valley. Cimorene found it difficult to imagine a dragon helping a wizard, but she couldn't say with certainty that it was impossible. And if Warog was involved with Antoro and Zeminar, it might explain why he'd been so touchy lately. When they arrived back at the cave, Cimorene shook herself free of her preoccupation. She and Eleonora unloaded their baskets and tied the herbs in bunches to hang in a dark corner of the kitchen to dry. How long will it be before I can use the feverfew? She asked worriedly. I'm not sure. It will take at least a week to dry thoroughly, but you might be able to use it in a spell before then. The directions don't say how dried the feverfew has to be. We can try it every day with a pinch of leaves from one of these branches if you like. I really do need it. I wonder if it would work without being dried, Cimorene said. She pulled a leaf from one of the hanging plants and shredded it carefully between her fingers. then pressed it up in the air and recited the rhyme. There, now light a candle or another lamp or something. Cimorene had already lit a candle and set it on the table. Cimorene moved over and stuck her finger in the flame. I think it's working, she said, and moved the rest of her hand closer. The sleeve of her dress caught fire. Cimorene hastily pulled her hand away from the candle and slapped at the flames, while Eleonora snatched up a bucket of water from beside the sink and poured it over Cimorene's arm. The fire went out, and so did the candle, and both Cimorene and Eleonora got thoroughly soaked. Oh dear, Eleonora said, ignoring her soggy skirts. Cimorene, did you burn yourself? No, Cimorene said, looking at her arm with a puzzled expression. I didn't feel a thing. I thought the spell worked, but nothing caught fire when we tested it before. It must be because the feverfew is fresh instead of dried, and I had hoped that I would be able to use it right away. If you're that low on dried feverfew, take some of mine, she offered. Kazul's not particularly irritable. I only need to keep a pinch or two in case of emergencies. Thank you, she said fervently, and Cimorene turned her soggy cuffs back and went to get the bottled spices. Chapter 11, in which Kazul is unwell and Cimorene makes a new acquaintance.